Welcome back, I'm Shane and this is Relative Time. Today we're going to take a look at a watch that I've been affectionately referring to as Captain Cronos. It's actually reference number L6006 from Cronos Watches, which is on Aliexpress. But since it's a bronze Captain Willard homage, Captain Cronos is fitting and kinda sounds better. Cronos is a newer brand on Aliexpress, and this is the second watch of theirs I've looked at. The first was a 62 Mas homage, and that's one that really impressed me. Gorgeous looking dial, rock solid build, great lume, and all for just over $200. So when they asked if I wanted to take a look at this one, I was curious if lightning could strike twice. Now before we begin, and just like the previous Cronos, this one was given to the channel, and they won't be asking for it back, which is the reason for that promotional tag at the beginning. So in terms of size, you're looking at a width of almost 44mm without the crown, and just over 45 width. Although that's 44 going from the 9 to the 3 and not counting these really pronounced crown guards. So it is a little bit on the larger side, but there's a lug-to-lug here of 46.6 and that helps compensate for that. Total thickness is 13.2, so that's not too bad for a 200-meter diver. And this does use 20mm straps, which is a little unusual. Typically with a watch this size, you would see 22. So it is one of the unusual quirks with this type of watch, and I think it makes the case look visually wider. Now on the wrist it feels pretty good. It feels a little wide as you might expect, but not overly large thanks to that shorter lug-to-lug, which also makes it sit squarely on my 7-inch wrist with no overhang. The width is something you get used to rather quickly, and overall it's pretty comfortable throughout the day. Even though the case shape is fairly similar to a turtle, I actually think the turtle is more comfortable even though it's a little bit wider, and not exactly sure why. The overall finishing on the bronze is pretty good here. It's very smooth to the touch with no rough or sharp angles. The sides have a high polish to them, but you're not going to see those too often, and that's all thanks to the curvature of the cushion case. Looking down, the case itself is entirely brushed, and the only glinting of any light you see comes from the edge of the crystal, the knurling on the crown, and a very narrow outer edge of the bezel which is polished. So even though the bronze is a bit flashy, it is a bit of a tool watch at heart. Although one thing to note is that this one is still a bit fresh, and as the patina develops on a bronze case, it becomes a lot harder to tell polished from brushed. The key defining characteristic of a Willard design is this extended and rather awkwardly protruding out crown guard at the fore, which seems to completely swallow the screwed-in crown hole. It's a little odd and a little cool, and occasionally when looking down on it, it kind of reminds me of a Nautilus shell. Now, thanks to this design, the crown is less accessible, as you might expect, so it can be more difficult to unscrew and access, as you can only grip it from the very top and the very bottom, and right when you start unscrewing it, you kind of need to constantly readjust your grip, at least until you get it out far enough. Flipping the watch over, you can see that there is a very simple polished steel case back, which is complete with all the particulars, and other than that, there's not much interesting from this angle. Now, the bezel itself is bronze, with a bronze insert, so to say it blends in with the case is kind of an understatement here. There is a coin edge that helps you get a grip, and overall it's fairly decent to use as long as you're gripping it between the lugs. Trying to grip it from the sides, it becomes a bit more difficult. The bezel is 120 click, unidirectional, and the action itself is pretty good, with a nice audible and tactile click with just a touch of backplay. So the bezel is pretty good, but personally I would have liked it if the insert wasn't bronze, just to add a little bit of color to the design. Although as it is, it does frame the sapphire crystal nicely. The crystal is a domed sapphire with an inner AR coating, and it has a little bit of an unusual cut. The last time I saw a crystal like this was on the Phoebus Leviathan. I'm not sure if it has a particular name, but it's pretty cool on a diver. Basically, it starts off rising from the bezel at a very aggressive flat angle, before it then quickly tapers off to a very shallow dome, which winds up creating a very cool optical distortion as you look at the outer edge, and especially so when the lume kicks in. Yet at the same time, as the center doesn't have much of a curve to it, it remains beautifully clear. There's some interesting options for this watch. Now, I believe there are 3 different dial colors. You have a blue, green, and black, as well as a choice between a regular dial and a sterile version. There's also a choice between 2 different movements, but I'll get to that later. This is the black dial version, and it has a very subtle sunburst effect. It's overall a gorgeous looking dial, but as you might expect, it can get a bit reflective. Now, at the very outer edge, you have a raised chapter ring, and unlike some other watches out there, this one appears to be lined up nicely. Moving inward, you have the applied indices, and for the most part, they're all squares, except for the 12, which morphs into sort of a double wedge. Now, fitting with the bronze case, they all have a nice gold frame. Although there is so much green C3 lume here that it often has a greenish tint, which looks kinda cool against the black backdrop. The same can be said for the hands, which are thinner sticks. The edges look a tad rough in macro, but in person they look smooth and great moving against the dial, as there's a ton of contrast here between the gold and white on the hands and the black of the dial, which makes reading the watch always clear and easy. The second hand is a golden stick with 2 dots at the end. You have a white one for lume and a red that really stands out and draws your eyes towards it. At the 3 we have a date, and it does have a nice frame to it, yet the positioning kinda disrupts the flow of the dial. I would have preferred it at the 6, but leaving it at the 3 is keeping with the style. One thing I really like is the contrasting finishes of the design. Where the brushed finish on the case kinda dulls the light, almost every inch of the dial is reflective in some fashion, from the framing of the indices to the sunburst dial to the hands themselves, and that really brings focus to the dial rather than the cushion case. On a steel cushion case, the dial wouldn't have much competition, but a bronze version has a lot of flash to it. Now, the last thing I want to point out is the text on the dial. The design of the logo at the top is going to be rather subjective, but overall I think it looks good. The main thing I want to talk about is the diver's 200 meter on the bottom, which kind of makes it sound like it's an ISO rated diver when it's not, so it should really say just 200 meters. Now, this was also on the other Cronos I looked at, and I pointed out to them and mentioned it could cause some confusion. As well as since then, I've got a lot of comments on that original review saying it is rather misleading. So I was kind of hoping they would take that email to heart and leave it off moving forward. Yet here we are again. So just kind of make of this what you will, and the only thing I'll say is that this is kind of a dumb situation, as the people who really understand what Divers 200 mean and are really looking for it are the same ones who are going to be suspicious when they see this on a $200 watch from an unknown brand. So I think it'd be simpler just to change it and avoid the issue entirely. Anyway, let's just move on to the lume, and here you can see that distortion I was talking about with the edge of the crystal, as it seems to almost double up the indices. Now, for a comparison, I was mostly interested to see how this performed to the previous Cronos, and for the most part it held up. The hands are a little thinner, so not as much surface area, which I think is why they fade out just a little bit before that 62 Mas, yet the dial keeps up nicely. Now, your lume is only as good as what's on your hand, and overall I think it's pretty good here, as it kept up with that other Cronos and outlasted a turtle. So as I talked about, there are 2 movement options. The first is a Selittla SW200 and the other is a PT5000. Since I wasn't sure what they sent me, I kind of opened this one up to check, and I found a decent but rather blank looking movement, so I gotta assume they sent me a PT5000. Now, the PT5000 is basically a Chinese ETA 2824 clone, which means it's going to be high beat, 38-hour power reserve, hacking, and hand winding. And that also means that it's going to be completely interchangeable with that SW200, as it's also based on the 2824. So the 2 different models should be identical, they just change out the movement. Now, this is one of the first times I've seen one of these PT5000s, and other than not running into any problems, I can't tell you a lot, especially when it comes to the long-term performance and reliability. Although I was curious to see how much these cost, and saw that a replacement movement runs about $70, which is actually twice what a Seiko NH35A runs. So there's definitely some value here, and especially in a watch that's only $190. And taking a look at the Selittla version at $289, that's actually pretty good for a Selittla movement. Although I think there's probably some of you out there who would have just preferred they stuck with a Seiko NH35A. But me personally, I think I would have preferred if they split the difference and went with the Miyota 9015. Now, in terms of straps, there's going to be a few different options, but this one came with this leather, kind of suede looking one. I've never really been a huge fan of suede looking straps, and especially so on a diver, but I gotta admit it's pretty comfortable, and it even has a matching buckle, although long term I'd probably still swap it to something else. Now, one thing I want to point out is that there isn't a lot of clearance between the spring bar and the case. So if you plan on using thicker leather straps or thicker NATOs, you're going to need a curved spring bar. So overall, the Captain Cronos is pretty impressive. But between it and the 62 Mas homage, I think I actually prefer the 62 Mas. Yet a lot of that has to do with my preference for the case shape and the handset. They're just a lot more appealing to me than what we have here. Plus, I do like bronze watches, but I think I prefer ones with more of a streamlined case. With a cushion case like we have here, there's a lot of bronze, and I think in some ways the presence of that case starts to compete with the presence of the dial. Although as a whole, I think the Captain Cronos here is pretty rock solid, and it's really just going to come down to the choice of the PT5000 movement. If it's really as good as a Selittla or an Edda, then that price is pretty fantastic for what you're getting, but I don't really know that until I spend some more time with it. So if this is a watch you're interested in, my advice would be to do some research on that movement and see what other people's experiences have been. Either that or look at the Selittla. Anyway, that's my take on the Captain Cronos, but let me know your thoughts on it below, and especially on that Captain Cronos name and what you think about that PT5000 movement. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.